All right. How is everybody doing? We are chugging right along today, and I'm super excited to be here, be able to talk to you about Firebase and how they can help you get your communications up and running with the Vonage API. So we're going to go through a few different things today. We will start with, excuse me. Let me hide this. There we go. That's better. All right. So we're going to start out by going through the Firebase ecosystem. We'll talk about a couple of the different pieces and kind of go through a little bit of that. Then we will talk through getting started, how to run a Firebase application and connect that with the Vonage API. Then I'm going to take you through some code examples and use cases that I think you'll be interested in looking at and understanding a little bit deeper. And then I got to finish it out with a couple of tips and tricks that I've picked up along the way, because I've definitely learned a lot over the last few months of just learning Firebase and learning how to use that with our Vonage API as well. So without further ado, let's start with the Firebase ecosystem. And we will talk through all the different parts, at least the main services that are offered. So the Cloud Firestore is essentially a NoSQL style database that allows you to store and sync data for all of your applications. Now, the nice thing about Firebase is it allows your applications to be iOS or Android or web-based. Doesn't really matter. So they all use the same storage if you were to use the Cloud Firestore. It does give you live synchronization and offline support, which is also useful in building applications. Then we have Cloud Functions, which allow you to essentially build and run a custom backend without having to create a server. Everything runs within their functions. They're small little bits of functionality that allow you to call them either with an HTTP request or as a method directly from the application, or they can even be triggered based off of other Google's cloud services. So the nice thing about these functions is when you use them as an HTTPS call, you can use them as a webhook, which allows you to integrate pretty tightly with the Vonage API, which is what I'm pretty excited about telling you about today. So then we have the cloud storage. Cloud storage is essentially where you're going to store images, audio, and video. The Firebase SDK also helps add some security for those file uploads, but it's essentially just a large storage system to let you keep assets that are required for your application. Then there's the real-time database, and for those of you who might remember pre-Google time, Firebase was just a real-time database when it first started. That has carried over and is still pretty efficient, pretty low latency. It's a great solution for a lot of things. However, if you're getting started out, they actually recommend Firestore now, and it integrates so tightly with everything else that it's almost the two are interchangeable at times. It just depends on how you want to set up your data and use it. So, but if you're just getting started, the Firestore is just probably the simplest way to go. They also offer different types of authentication setup. So if you want to have Google authentication, Facebook authentication, just email and password, all those different types. They have a user set up for you to use, so you can actually easily put in authentication into your application without having to go through the process of setting up all of the all the security details around typical authentication methods. So it reduces a lot of the code you'd have to write. They also have hosting. So if you need to host web applications or anything like that, you can use that. And then the ML kit, which also brings machine learning directly to like a mobile app. And it's a fairly straightforward way to to get started with machine learning as well. It is in beta, but it's anytime you use Firebase, you have access to it now, and you can get started using machine learning. So lots of great stuff there. And these are the main services that they outline. And Cloud Firestore, Functions, and Storage are the three that we'll be dealing with mostly today, because those three are kind of the first touch points you want to hit, and Functions with their webhook capabilities will help us tie in to Vonage fairly simple. So the other side of the needs that you're going to have is the command line tool. The command line tool for Firebase is essentially the way to initialize projects, set up all your emulations, add the environment variables and the Firebase config, do deployments and testing, all different pieces on your command line to allow you to run your project, get started with it, make it happen. But that Firebase CLI is really important, and it's a piece that you will have to have to move forward with any Firebase project. They do have native installers for Windows, Mac, and Linux. They also, which is what I do, I just install it as a global NPM module because I'm a JavaScript guy, so I get to use the NPM modules. But if you have NPM installed, they have a module for it, and you can just use that as well. So lots of different options. And the way I go about doing that is I install it as a global, and then you can type in Firebase, which is the method for the command line tool, the function that you'll need. You log in, which will bring up OAuth for Google. You put in your credentials, and then projects list would give you all the projects you have already created. If you have none, it'd show you none, but that would be the easiest way to get installed and figure out if you are up and running. Okay, so that is everything we need to know really about the ecosystem. There's a whole lot more. There's obviously their documentation is great. It's expansive, so you'll definitely want to know where that exists. But we have all kinds of great stuff there to help us get up and running. But let's talk a bit about getting started with the Vonage API and Firebase. Okay, so let's look at the Vonage application side first. When you log into a Vonage API dashboard, you will have the ability to find your applications on the left menu there. And when you create a new application, there's all different types of pieces that you need to put in. You want to create a friendly identifier, generate a public and private key for it because you'll need those for some of the different functionality. And then the capabilities you can turn off and on. When you turn those capabilities on, you'll need to have some URLs. Now, if you turn all this stuff on to begin with, you can post in kind of a placeholder URL until later because you won't actually get those URLs until you've published a function on Firebase. And I'll show you what that looks like in a second. But if you leave the stuff off and just create the application, you should be able to go through, and then you'll get the API key and secret for your account, and then you'll get the private key file downloaded, and the application ID as well. So those are the four pieces you'll need for Firebase. So then creating the Firebase application. The simplest way to create a Firebase application, there are two ways. One would be with the command line tool, but you end up having to go into the dashboard anyways to make sure a couple of things are set up properly. So I just start out by creating a project the easy way. I give it a name, I turn on analytics, and then essentially I just hit finish, and it just kind of runs it off from there. I pick an account and I hit finish, and then it builds it up. Tells me it's ready to go, and once it's ready to go, I can then go straight into the dashboard and make a couple of minor changes to that when I get started. But it only takes about a minute or so to go through the process. So a couple of the main things you have to know is when you first set this up, you will need to set up the resource location. Pick one that's near you. But but also pick one that works well with Firebase. They have some examples on which ones to pick and a list of good ones to use. And then you also need to make sure to pick the Blaze plan, which allows you to then call external APIs. If you were on the Spark plan, you could do most everything you need to do, but unfortunately, they only have the current the pay-as-you-go plan available for calling external APIs. I've never really gone over my free tier in all of the, kind of the practice stuff that I've been doing and learning. And so I think you would have to use the pay-as-you-go pretty extensively to get out of that free tier, which is kind of nice. They're very generous with that free level. So once you do that and you get the dashboard all set up, and then you want to go into your command line, and you're going to initialize your functions using the command line, their CLI, and then that will run you through some of the project setup. So you can associate it specifically with with a project directory and a Firebase project. You can create multiple aliases, all that kind of thing. It'll ask you if you want to use JavaScript or TypeScript or all the different pieces that you're going to need. And it prompts you for all those things, and you just connect it. So when you do this and you already have a project set up, it'll ask you, do you want to use one of the projects you've already set up? You click yes, you select that specific one, and then it just ties all the connections in there for you, which is really great. Once you've initialized functions and everything, then you can set up your configuration. So those 4 pieces I told you about earlier from the Vonage API, you would use here, and you would just create a configuration setup that will be used as environment variables later. So you have the API key, API secret, application ID, and private key. So you just simply copy and paste those in, without changing or modifying anything. The private key is usually a tricky one. If you're going to screw anything up, that would probably be it. I've had to redo that a couple of times to get it right. But if you do it last and just paste directly from the file without adding anything else, it tends to work that way. Another option might be to add it to your cloud storage and call it directly from there as well. That might introduce a little bit more latency where this is just an environment variable. So there may be some other options you could explore, but this I found is the easiest way to do it. And you pop those in, and it creates your configurations, and you're off and running. Once you have that, then you can start to deploy. Now, in this case, you use Firebase deploy. I put only functions. It deploys every function I have available. And then it will spit out the function URL, as you see by the big white arrow. This particular one was a call log for my voice system. So I have in voice, my answer, which is essentially my webhook page, and a log call function in there. I can copy and paste that and put that back into my capabilities in the Vonage API platform. You can also use the Vonage API also has a CLI tool as well, and you can associate them there. But visually, this gives you a good idea of where things would go and how they would work. And if you want to use a command line tool, you can look that up as well. Okay, so with that, we are ready for some code examples. So the first one up is going to be using the SMS API. And then the use case would be a multiple keyword queue. So if, let's say you have some sort of contest entry that you want to set up, and you want to have different code words, code words of the day or something like that. One way you could do that is to use a keyword queue with PubSub. So let's take a look at what that flow kind of looks like. So you'd have a user who uses their phone to send an SMS message to a phone number. That phone number would go into the Vonage API, which would then call the webhook, and that webhook would then would be the Firebase function that would get called. So that Firebase function would then publish a topic to the Google Cloud PubSub service. And then when that PubSub service picks up that topic, Firebase has a trigger for onPublish. So anytime there's a new one published, it goes back and triggers that Firebase function, which would then trigger back something in return to the user. So that can be whatever you like that to be. But essentially, this would allow any number of people to send SMS messages at the same time, and it would use PubSub as the queuing system to run through all the different pieces and do the functionality you need it to do. So the code for that looks something like this, where a webhook uses the functions library from Google, creates an HTTPS on request method, and then that particular callback looks like this. So you would create the new pub sub, you would get all the request body and buffer that because it expects a buffer as an input. And then in this case, I just do a switch case, right? So it's a pretty straightforward way, I think, of switching in between different keywords like this. You can have similar, now you can use similar keywords that do the same type of functionality, but maybe more like a, like an assistant sort of thing where it expects a couple of different phrases, or there's a couple of different possibilities. You can also, double them up like that. You can do all kinds of different things. But essentially at that point, if case hello comes in, it will publish the topic hello and pass the data in. If it was ping, it would publish that data to that specific topic and then respond to the Vonage API service with a 200 so it knows that it accepted it. From here, we have two other functions then that would be triggered by the publish event for that specific topic. So anytime something comes into the hello topic, it would grab the data from the buffer and then run a send SMS method, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But my send SMS message is just going to use the next JavaScript SDK to send a message, and it promises that. So it would then, if it was hello, it would return world. If it was ping, it would return pong. And the final results would look something like this. Yep, so just like that. So now you can get very specific as to which keyword does which, and that incoming webhook method would allow you to do all kinds of different pieces, and then split them out into different functionality based on whatever that needed to do. So, all right, so let's move on to messages now. And in this particular instance, we're using DialogFlow with Facebook Messenger. So the example for this use case would be something like you have a online AI tool for customer support or restaurant management, booking a table or updating an airline ticket, all kinds of different stuff you can do here. With DialogFlow, the beauty of that is the intents and entities and all the knowledge base that you can set up. It gets really powerful. In my instance, I used a pre-built agent. They have a ton of pre-built agents to get you started, so you can kind of learn through some of the different things. And that's how I got up and running in literally no time. It was just a matter of getting a pre-built agent, trying it out, connecting everything with the Vonage API, and seeing how it went. So that workflow looks a little bit like this. You have a user, and that user will send a Facebook message, and that message gets then ported over to the Vonage API, and your application will pick that up. So you make a connection between the Facebook page and that Facebook Messenger application will send a copy over to Vonage for processing. So once that comes through, that incoming message will call a webhook in Firebase Functions, which then calls DialogFlow. And this is going to look very similar because DialogFlow is going to pick up on that intent. It's going to send back text to the Firebase function, and that Firebase function then sends a response back to Facebook and the user. So that code, again, very similar. We have a webhook with a HTTPS on request method, and everything comes in. And then we have another method we'll call shortly that's called DialogFlow Gateway. That DialogFlow Gateway will take the message and the content from the Vonage API webhook and the from ID. And the from ID here I'm using as a, it's essentially as a conversation ID for DialogFlow specifically. So they have a request so they know which one it is, like which user it is, and they keep that conversation isolated. Vonage API also has a conversations API, and you could actually use that and get even more granular, and then you can have an AI with multiple people and get a little more in depth with it. But for this one, I just use the from ID from the Facebook Messenger, and then I send the message back from the response. So the response gives me the fulfillment text, and I send that back all in one quick webhook. So the DialogFlow gateway looks like this, where it takes the text and the session ID, creates a session client, gets all the path and everything, and then it sends in the query input and does a detect intent, and whatever that detect intent returns is what I'm sending back to the other method. So, so you'll see here this response where I'm waiting for that method to finish up. That response is what's coming directly from DialogFlow's detect intent method. So once we're done with that, then you get something like this, where you get some dad jokes, where you ask the AI bot to tell me a joke, and it says, worrying works. 90% of the things I worry about never happen. It's 100% accurate. So that's what that looks like, and that's all through Vonage API, the messaging API, and connecting Facebook to it. You can also connect like WhatsApp and Viber and eventually SMS. SMS kind of works now. You can send SMS messages. So, but check that out. The messaging API is great. It's got a lot of really powerful functionality, and it's we have a couple of good tutorials to help you get connected fairly easily. So. All right, next is the Verify API. So this would be like confirming a user's phone number. There's multiple ways of going about confirming a user's phone number, but in this particular instance, we're going to use the Verify API, where a user would go into a website and they would add their phone number to their user data. And then from there, you can actually create several triggers. So this can go directly to the function. This can also go to a data store as well. So if I send this to the Cloud Firestore, that can trigger the function, which is the example I'll show you in a second. So that gets triggered. That function then fires off a request for a verification code from the Vonage API, which then sends a text message to the user. So once that user gets that text message, they can then interact with the website or whatever mechanism you need. They can type that verify code back in, which then calls another function, and that checks that code against the Vonage API and returns a success or failure based off of whatever's returned. So in this instance, I use whenever a document for user details is changed, I filter out a few of the different options. So if there's not a phone number to send to, or we're in the process, or they've already verified their phone number, we don't do anything. But if they've just added a phone number and nothing else has been changed or verified, then we would create the options to send from a Vonage Verify brand name workflow ID number 6. And there's several different workflows that the Verify API allow. Number 6 is SMS only, because it worked for me. You can also have it with different steps where it'll send a text message, it'll call them with a number a couple minutes later, and kind of continue the process until it gets a response or times out. Then the PIN expiration, I put it 120 seconds, and then I send that off through a function, and it returns, ideally, will return a request ID. So that request ID will then tell us that it's been accepted and something's been sent to them. And to match those two, the response up to the verification API, you'd want to have that request ID handy and pass that back. So that gets put into the user detail which then would update the front end application. And that front end application at that point would allow us to make an API call, or you can actually create a method that calls the function directly from the front end. It takes the request ID from that particular body, from that particular user, takes the request ID, takes the body code, takes the code that was sent in. I keep wanting to call it more parameters than I need to. So the request ID and the code from the front end directly, sends it into the check, lost my place, sends it into the check, gives the user details an update when everything comes back properly. You would obviously want to have a check for if there was a failure here. I just assume that I got it right. Not always happens, but sometimes, sometimes I make mistakes. Everybody makes mistakes and they type it in wrong. So you want to have something there to cover that. But this one, I put it in right and it goes through and it changes my verification to true, which looks like this as a final result, to where in my user detail document, I have my phone number and verified now equals true. So that would go through and allow me to do all kinds of different things on the front end to make sure they're verified. Now I can send them things. If they don't have something verified, I can ask for that to happen, that kind of stuff. So. All right, voice API. This one's the most complex, but we'll get through it in 3 minutes and be good to go. All right, so call forwarding and recording. So this would work if you have multiple people in an account and you want to be able to have a proxied phone number for them, right? So now you have a Vonage phone number that gets called, and that's then associated. So let's walk through that. So we're going to have a Vonage user calling a Vonage phone number. That Vonage phone number is outgoing, and it hits Vonage, which then calls the API or the webhook for answer, which will call our Firebase function. So that Firebase function then calls the data store, Cloud Firestore here, and it will find that user's phone number looked up. So it will say this phone number from Vonage associates with this particular user, and then you can, if you need to change that, change who's if you have a pool of like 20 numbers or something, and you want to multiply, move people around between the numbers, then it's calling a specific number and it's matching it up to a specific person. So what that happens at that point is it will return an NCCO object to Vonage, which will then run a outgoing call to me. So that would be, in this particular instance, it was my phone number. So that would connect the call based off of the number. If you were just doing this one-to-one, it would be much simpler. You just put your phone number in, hard code it. You don't need to look up. But I'm showing you how you would do this if you have, a pool of numbers that you'd want to pick through and cycle through and be able to figure out who belonged to who, which number belonged to which user. So then once I get that call, we are now connected through the API, and that the Vonage system will connect the two of us on the same line. Once that call finishes, in that NCCO object, we have a response that gives us a webhook for the recording. So it'll call that webhook in the functions, in Firebase functions, which then passes the recording, downloads the recording, and sends it, uploads it into cloud storage. So this particular webhook looks like this, where you get a incoming phone call. So this would be the answer webhook. Incoming phone call, checks that phone lookup, gets the number, sets up the recording action, and then connects the from number to the looked up phone number from Firestore. Then it returns 200 and sends back the NCCO object. Once that finishes, here's the, so if you see here where that event URL is for voice answer log call, that will be the recording method that happens. So this log call grabs the recording URL and the conversation unique identifier, start time, end time, everything else, saves that file up, creates some metadata, uploads it to the bucket at a specific destination, and then deletes the original file and sends back a status of 200. It's all good to go at that point. So now your final response would look like this, where you have these MP3s uploaded directly to your Firebase storage inside your account and ready to go and use it at will. Okay, so some tips and tricks, and I will get through these pretty quickly. So use the emulator. I struggled with just speed for a while and realized this emulator exists for a reason. And once you figure out how to use it, there's a couple of pieces that you have to set it up. But once you get it going, you get your Google app credentials, and then you set that up, and then you pull down the Firebase functions configuration into a runtime JSON file, and then you start the emulator, and now you can just save it and run all these functions right off your machine, which is fantastic. So if you've tried Firebase and you don't like having to push all or deploy all the time, definitely learn how to use the emulator. It makes your life a lot easier. The Nextmo library currently is not in a state where it uses promises. It uses callbacks, but callbacks are unfortunately not called properly from Firebase. So the promise has to be created here. It's a relatively easy way to create them. You just have a new promise, call the Nextmo method that you need, and then if it's an error, you reject, and if not, you resolve with a response. And that's all you need to do to make sure that all of these work. So everywhere I was doing like verify request or verify check and all those different pieces, send SMS and message, I was using this essentially. So it's just a way to work around only having callbacks in the SDK right now. The other thing is just keep your functionality small. Don't try to do too much. One or two things is all you're going to need. Outside of that, if you're doing more than a couple of things, you've just got way too much going on in your function, and you need to trim that down. I got in a position where I was doing way too much at once, and then it's easy to get lost. It's easier for things break. So just keep them small and easy, and you'll be in good shape. Okay, so this is the link, and I will share the slides as well, but this is the link for the example code. There's a whole repository of different Google application examples in the Firebase one. This links directly to that, so I would highly recommend, if you want to learn more, to head there and check it out. And I think I might have time for a question. I am not sure, but I will leave that to the experts.
Well, I'm honored that you think I'm an expert, but we have a couple questions for you in the Q&A.
Okay.
How do you find the learning curve for Firebase, especially for new developers?
Firebase, there's only a couple of minor gotchas, which really aren't too bad. If you understand JavaScript and you understand how to write an Express.js JavaScript application, you should have no problem doing this. There's also, I believe, Python and Go are supported in functions. There's a lot of little pieces that you kind of have to figure out, but once you get past some of that, it's not too hard. The learning curve, I would say, give yourself about a month just to sort of work through some things. The hardest part I really had was just finding exactly what I was looking for in documentation. Once I found it, it smoothed some of those problems out. But yeah, that's a good question.
Okay. Do you write any content about these topics? I really like all the things you described in your talk.
Yeah, so I have a couple out there on our developer blog site. I have a few more that I'm going to start writing about in the near future. So next week is going to be, I'm going to write a blog post. It won't come out next week. I'm actually literally writing it next week on Messenger, Facebook Messenger, and DialogFlow and the messaging API. So I'm going to be doing that next week. That's scheduled, I think, to come out early June. So that would be one to look out for coming up. But yeah, definitely writing more and more, and that's sort of my sole responsibility. So if you grab my Twitter handle and you have some suggestions or ideas or questions or anything, feel free to hit me up, and I will gladly answer those and help you through whatever you might get stuck on. So.
Okay, one last quick one, which kind of feeds into that. Is it possible to test the Facebook bot in the sandbox? I'm assuming that's the messages sandbox.
I've not tried it, but I would imagine you can. I've actually not gone through that process. I wanted to know what it was like to set my own up, so I didn't actually use the sandbox. But I would imagine it's probably not too hard. You just need to give it a way to call the webhook for Firebase. Once you're able to update a webhook to the Firebase link, you can do anything you want at that point. So.
Okay, awesome. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed the talk.
Awesome.
Let's see. We are going to go for a social break now. So we will be back.